All right. I'm going to keep on getting kicked off. So real quick, go ahead and introduce yourself, Martin. And we are looking for speakers. So if you have anything you need to speak, please let me know. So Martin, can you go ahead and take it away for us? Short on Martin, go ahead and take over for us. And we need speakers. That's it.
All right, taking over. Can you see my screen? One second. All right, I think we're good. So, welcome. I'm going to be talking about TypeScript and CRM and how it works and why you should be using TypeScript for making web resources. Small agenda, I'll talk a bit about a small intro, then I'll talk about why JavaScript has its good sides, but also its bad sides. Then I will talk about TypeScript and why, in my opinion, it's much superior to JavaScript. Finally, we'll see how client-side coding is done in CRM. And I will demo this tool that I've made a couple of years ago that really enables you to make this much more safely and faster than normal. Intro. This is me. I'm educated as a software engineer. I work on a daily job as a Dynamics CRM consultant. I've created several tools to aid CRM development, not just the one I'm talking about today, but a few others as well. And through these tools, my company has decided to name me Chief Architect of CRM Development. So I kind of set the standard of how we develop stuff and how we go about most daily development in our consultancy. Delegate is a company I work at. It started up in 2006, and currently there's about 65 employees. Originally it was only SharePoint projects, but in 2013 we started the CRM department. And currently we have around 12 full-time CRM consultants in our firm and 2 students. We have a big focus on development tools and automation to make our daily jobs of developing stuff for our clients much faster and much safer and much easier. And this is what I'm here to talk about today. So a bit about our tools, other tools than the one I'm talking about today. Our oldest tool is called Exim. It is like our Swiss Army knife of tools, sort of like Exim Toolbox, but a scripting version of it. It has a lot of stuff it can do, but I'll just mention a few of them. A big important one is plugin sync, which is our plugin registration through code, where we basically write this sort of statements in our plugins, in our constructor, where like we call this register plugin step on an account. We want to call an update on post operation. We want to call this function. We want to add an image, for example, and we want to filter it on certain attributes. This is just something we write in our code. We run our plugin sync script tool, and it automatically finds all the registrations in our code and applies them in CRM, which means that we don't have to use the plugin registration tool at all, which I see as a huge benefit because it's just so clunky, in my opinion. And it's much better to have it in your code, because that way you have it in your version control as well. So you can always go back in your version control to see how your images were registered before you changed it. Another small thing is web resource sync, similar to plugin sync. It looks at your local files in your project and basically just synchronizes all the web resources it finds as CRM web resources. So we don't have to go into CRM manually and create all of them and copy and paste in the JavaScript or the HTML or the CSS or whatever web resource we're having. So that basically automates all of the web resource handling. We also have an extended solution export import, which we've made because we don't believe the normal solution export import in CRM is sufficient. For example, the states of workflows and the states of plugins and views and stuff are not synchronized properly. So, for example, if you delete a view in your development environment and you roll out to your production environment, the view does not get deleted in your production environment. It just stays there. So this, for example, will then delete your view in the production environment if it finds out that it has been deleted in your development environment. Next up is our newest tool. It's called Exim Markup. It's a testing framework, and it's a quite big endeavor. The purpose of it is to basically simulate an entire CRM environment locally in memory with all your metadata, all your plugins, all your workflows, so you can write simple and concise unit tests to test all of your logic. So yeah, you can debug and test your plugins code, your workflows, and the code you have in the code activities. You can also test your security roles and your business unit setup and much more. We have basically started re-implementing CRM to be able to run it locally and do all of our testing. Yep, and it runs the entire pipeline. So it looks at all the plugin registrations we have and all the workflow registrations we have. And whenever you run, for example, create on an account, it will check what kind of logic it has to run. For example, this will not be run because it's an update of account, but there might be a workflow that is run on create, and it will automatically create those. So it basically simulates your entire CRM environment. It is quite cool, and I think people should check it out after this. We have more tools. We have open source most of them on our GitHub page if you want to see more. But today we are talking about this tool called XrmDefinitelyTyped, which makes it way easier and much more possible to use correct TypeScript in your code, and it helps you a great deal to code faster. So let's look at JavaScript and why it's a problem sometimes. JavaScript, it's a dynamically typed language. It has implicit types. It's a scripting language. It's evaluated at runtime, so there's no compile checks. And every browser that's out there has a different implementation because there's no core JavaScript library that everyone extends. They all have to implement their own based on some description that the JavaScript team sets out to the browsers to use. So what do some of these things mean? For example, the dynamically typed, if we have a variable x, if you don't define it to anything, it has to type undefined. Then we can set it to null, for example, then it has to type null. Then we can set it to a number, 1, then it changes type to a number. And then we can also just change the type to a string, and then it's suddenly a string. So there's no set typing for this x variable. It can be pretty much whatever we want to do or have it be. So for example, down here in this function, we can do x.length, which is a function on or a property on certain types. For example, string has a length, and an array has a length property, but for example, a type of number does not have a length property. So if x was a number, this would fail because it would say, I cannot find length on a number. We can also have function in JavaScript, which can take variables and can return stuff, of course. But this function doesn't really say much about what it actually does. Sure, it adds up two a and b's, but what is a and b? Is a number? Is a string? Is a date? What is it? And to be honest, JavaScript doesn't care, and neither could you. If you don't care, you can do it like this. It's fine. But to me, this is just not good coding style because it could be whatever. And if you give in a number and a number, then it adds them together as numbers. If you give in a string and a number, then it concatenates the number onto the string with this function. So yeah, I just find that bad practice not to have set functionality of your functions. So yeah. An example of CRM JavaScript that can just go horribly wrong, in my opinion, is a quite common use case when you have dependent option sets. For example, if I have a drop down here with an option set and I choose one of them, then I want another option set down below, change what options are available in that option set. Options in option sets are numbers underneath. So this is some code that I've made in production, taken over from another firm, that tries to accomplish this. So basically it has an array, which is a current type, which is the resulting options in the second option set that is changed after selecting the first one. Then he switches on the attribute of the first. Let's say this is the first one. So if the first one has option 1, let's say it's accounting here, and 2 is agriculture, then if it's accounting, then it should change the other option set to have these 4 options. If it's agriculture and non-veg or whatever, it should change these options instead in the second option set. And then he goes on. Now you could argue that you could put in some more comments, more saying comments than, for example, this one, or you could have some variables that describes what 1 is and what 2 is and what all these numbers are, because right now it's quite obscure what is happening, unless you read through the code and know what this field is and what it's attempting to do. So you might argue this might be okay if you put in some comments. But the thing is, I didn't show you the entire switch statement, because this switch statement is actually 21 cases long, and every single one of them has different numbers in these arrays. And if you have to maintain this in any sort of way, if you change one of the options in one of the option sets, you have to figure out, oh, that's 54, so I have to change 54 here and 54 somewhere else where it's also present. I can't even see any, but if there are any, it's just, yeah, it's not maintainable at all, in my opinion, and we fixed it when we got this project. And this is how I imagine the developer was looking like when he was sitting and coding this. He just got a task like, do this, and he did it, and says, this is fine. So JavaScript in a nutshell, there's no type checking, there's no IntelliSense for you. It has dynamic typing, which some might argue is nice, because then you can code fast and you can do whatever you want, which can be good in certain cases, but not if you want maintainable code. It has no high-level language features like classes and interfaces. Some of the newer JavaScript versions has this, but not all browsers support it, so you have to not use them, because else like Internet Explorer doesn't support your code. And as I showed before, it becomes unmaintainable quite fast if you just keep writing more and more JavaScript without having any checks on your types or any sort of help to guide you towards the correct code. What is JavaScript? I would say it's like the Wild West. You can be really good at it, and you can be so cool and own the entire West if you want. But again, if you mess up one time, you get shot in the back by a rogue bandit or whatever, then you're dead, and there's no coming back from that. So we got TypeScript instead. What is TypeScript? It is basically just JavaScript with optional types on top. So let's look at some code. We have a let x equals to 1 here. Then the TypeScript compiler knows that x is a number, which means that if I try to assign a string to x afterwards, then it will give me an error that string is not a number. I cannot assign this. So already here, my code has caught like, you should not be assigning strings to numbers, because then I don't know what you're trying to do. We have our add function here. It's also valid in TypeScript. It automatically puts in any types, which as the type sounds like, it's an any type. It can be anything. And it works just as the JavaScript version. But the more proper way would be to have more concise function names and type definitions. For example, add numbers, where you define that A has to be a number and B has to be a number, and the output is also a number. And likewise for a concatenating function, A is a string, B is a string, and it outputs a string, even though the function does the same thing. This is much better and much more readable and maintainable. When it's run through the TypeScript compiler, it compiles to regular old JavaScript code, so you can just use it as you've always used it, put it into your web resources, and keep going. Of course, there's static type shaping, this part where it knows that this is a number, so you cannot have a string assigned to it. It provides IntelliSense. I'll show that later in my demo. It also has a cool feature where it checks for the flow of variable types. I will also demo this, but that's like a really awesome feature that TypeScript has that not even C# has. So TypeScript is actually ahead of C# in this department. And finally, it produces scalable and maintainable JavaScript code, because you have types everywhere. You have much more limited options, but limited options are sometimes much better, because that means you can usually only do it the right way if the types are properly put in. TypeScript is made by Microsoft. and it's open source on GitHub. They're quite good at frequently updating it. There's a lot of new cool stuff, like every quarter or something. There's a new bigger update with a ton of new functionality, and it's quite exciting to follow along what they come up with. So how do you use TypeScript with like JavaScript libraries in general and APIs like the form API in CRM or the web API in CRM? Well, it's through these files called declaration files, which ends in d.ts. And these files basically just contain interfaces and classes and functions that describes how this JavaScript library that you're trying to use actually works. These files are not included in output JavaScript code, since they are just a description of how you should be using the API. That means you can have as many declaration files as you want. It will not make your JavaScript files any bigger. So that's a big plus. It's just a compiler helper that makes your code more correctly. Most of these declaration files are community-driven for all different JavaScript libraries. And on GitHub, it's called DefinitelyTyped. And it's easy to make your own declaration files if you have your own library or your own JavaScript library that you have no typings for. You can just make your own file and describe how it's supposed to be used and go ahead and use it with your TypeScript code. The CRM form API is also on DefinitelyTyped, this community-driven one, where I know Devil has contributed a bit. And it describes the form API quite nicely of how you can interact with the form. But the problem with these typings is that they are static. They are not tailored to your specific environment. So we'll say later why that's important, that they should not be static. But basically, they are generic typings that can work for any CRM instance and not specifically yours. This is where this tool, XrmDefinitelyTyped, that I've made a few years ago, it provides dynamic typings for your CRM instance. That means it reads your forms and figures out which attributes and which controls are on it, and generates these declaration files for each specific form that basically allows you to not make any mistakes in your attribute names and in your types when you're interacting with the form. So TypeScript in a nutshell, it has type checking from the name TypeScript. Intelligent autocomplete, gonna show that later. Static types has a lot of high-level language features, such as classes, interfaces, enumerations, a lot of normal stuff that you have in languages like C#. It also has some of the newest JavaScript features that some browsers don't support yet, like async await and arrow functions, lambda functions, they're also called. And then it has this cool control flow analysis I'll be getting into soon. So what is TypeScript? It's sort of like this toy. It limits your options to how you can use it, but it also guides you to do the right thing. Of course, you can take off the lid and put all the things down in anyway, but that would be just not using TypeScript the right way. So it makes it easier as a toy, and it helps you do the right thing by guiding you doing the right thing. Yeah. So client-side coding in CRM. There's the form API, which has some calls that look sort of like this. You can get a attribute and have some string that defines what attribute. Then you could get the value. You can get an attribute. Then you can set the value with some value. Then you can get a control, and you can clear a notification, and you can interact with tabs and the sections on that tab, and you can interact with controls on that tab. And you can even interact with the entity itself and get its ID, for example. Now, the problem is that, first of all, you need to know all these xrm.page.getAttribute and all these other functions that you need to type in correctly, else it's not going to work. The second, and what I find most important, is you need to know the exact string to access an attribute, control, etc. For example, you need to know that it's called account number in all lowercase and in one word. If you had the A in uppercase, then this wouldn't work. It has to be lowercase and has to be this exact string. Similar to this web resource underscore record wall, which has some sort of casing and an underscore. And this is the exact string that you have to use to actually interact with this specific control and clear the notifications. Another very, very important thing is that you need to know what type the control or attribute holds in order to use it. For example, The account number get value, you might think, oh, account number, that's a number when you get out the value, but actually account number is a string, which most CRM developers know by now. But to a new person, this might be very confusing that this is actually a string and not a number. Similarly for lookup fields or entity references, when you set the value and get the value, you actually get an array of entity references and not just a single one. Don't ask me why, but I have some ideas why, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But this is a very common error that you don't put in an array of entity references into your lookup fields to actually have the right value come in. So yeah, that's a few of the reasons why I've developed this tool, and I'm gonna show later why it works so well. There's also some web endpoints. There's 2 of them for JavaScript or web. There's the old organization data.svc, which is found as this URL, and here I'm just getting all the accounts. But there's also the new web API for CRM 2016 Plus, which is a much nicer URL and has some plurality here instead of these set things. They work sort of similar in that they are both using OData queries where you can filter and you can select and you can expand and you can do other stuff like it contains and starts with and stuff like that. And they also, of course, both work with JSON objects in that they interact with JavaScript. So when you query stuff and you send in stuff, you work with JSON objects. This one is newer, and it also has a few bugs, even in this newest version that there's there. But it's, in my opinion, a way different approach to this one. Some cases I use this one still. Other cases I use this one. Of course, they're going to deprecate the old one soon, so everyone should be switching to the web API. But I found certain limitations in the web API that you need to use the old one to actually get the data you want. So for these, there are some helper libraries. For the old organization data, they had the SDK.rest.js from the SDK, which provides some JavaScript helper functions that would help you retrieve data and create data and update data and so stuff like that. Whereas for the web API, there's usually a lot of community libraries. I've lost count of how many there are, and of course, my tool also has a library that helps do this, and I'll show it off later and argue a bit of why I think it's the better one to choose, but we'll see. So let's demo, look at some code. First off, TypeScript. This is the web page for it. If you don't have it, go download it. It's for all the Visual Studios or whatever editor you're using, and you can also install it with npm. Here, I have 2 files. I have on my left side a TypeScript file, and on my right side, the resulting JavaScript file. To make this work, you also need a tsconfig, which is a TypeScript config file. I'll just show it here, which is just some settings for the TypeScript compiler that says how it should handle compiling the TypeScript. For example, you can compile and save. A lot of settings that are strict and what type of JavaScript it should compile into. I'll not go into this. You can look it up yourself, but it's quite nice to have it. So let's showcase it. As I said, JavaScript doesn't have classes, but TypeScript does. So let's make a class here and see what happens. I save my TypeScript file. The TypeScript compiler has picked it up and outputted this JavaScript. You might say this doesn't look like a class in JavaScript, and you're right, because there are no classes in JavaScript. So to achieve classes in JavaScript, you have to have these functions within functions that call other functions and return the proper values. And as you see, when I expand this class in TypeScript, you see how this code just becomes more and more unreadable. But then again, you should not be reading your JavaScript code. You should be coding in your TypeScript code, which makes sure that all works as it should be. And yeah, the TypeScript JavaScript code just is something that you use in your actual browser. So let's have, for example, a first name, and we'll have a last name. I'll save that. We'll see nothing happens because this just describes the class. There's nothing actual saved yet. But we can have like a function in here as well, where we return the first name. Of course, it's this first name because we're in this class right now. And we'll concatenate the strings and this last name. Notice the intelligence that I get, of course, on this. I have different completions. So that way, I'll save it, and it prototypes this function in, as is the way you make functions in JavaScript. You have a prototype function that actually does what you need to do. And then the variables are still not shown because variables on classes in JavaScript are not specifically declared. They are just stored in the object that it is. Of course, I'm going to show off a few cooler TypeScript things as well. For example, we have the template strings, where you can use these special quote marks, and you can then do this thing, sort of like the new C# string templating, which is just makes it much easier to make your complex strings instead of concatenating stuff. So this, for example, would just be a string that has a space between this first name and last name, just as before. Now we can also have interfaces, as I mentioned. So we can have an account, for example, which describes our account, and it can also have fields in it, like so. And of course, our class can implement this. And if I add a full name in here, it should complain, hopefully. Yeah. So it complains that the type account is incurrently implements this, the full name is not compatible. So it tells you right now that I'm expecting then this class to have an interface that has these properties, but your class does not have this. I did, though, make a function that returns a string. So if I do like this, then it works again, because a function and a property are two different things. Cool. We can also have stuff like enums, for example, gender, where we can have male, female, other, or unknown. Let's say that. You can see it compiles to, again, some JavaScript code that may not be very pretty, but you don't look at the JavaScript code. But this actually is how you would implement an enum in JavaScript, in this version of JavaScript. We can also have it be a constant enum, which then removes it over here. But if I, for example, try to use it in my code, gender.other, for example, then it will actually, in my JavaScript code, know that, oh, other is equals 2. By the way, you can also just do like this and give them other numbers if you want. Like so. And then it has 45 over here, and it even provides a comment for you that, oh, this constant enum is actually the other one. So if you end up reading your JavaScript code, you know that this enum is actually the other in the gender. Cool. So let's look at this control flow thing that I was talking about. I have an example class or example function here with some classes. I have class A through E, and I have some function that takes in an object which can either be A, B, C, D, or E. Either of these classes, it can be. This is how you annotate that it can either be that or that by having this order operator. So we can actually use the TypeScript compiler to help us here. So for example, if the object is an A, then if we look at the type of this object in here, it actually has the type A. That's nice. So we can actually, if A had a thing on it, a property, then we could do dot, and it would have the property A on it and nothing else. Cool. Let's move on. If it's not a C class or a D class, well, then what is it? It's a B or E class. That's because it's not a C or a D class, and it's not an A class because this if statement has already checked for that. So it can only be the two remaining, which are B and E. Or if it's a C class, then again, it's just a C class. Else, in the end, it has to be a D class because that's the only class we haven't had a check for where it succeeded. Now, what happens if we actually have all the checks for all our classes? So I'm just going to copy this here, and we're going to check this for instance D instead. Of course, it's going to have the type D in here, but what type is it going to have down here? Because last time it had D, but we've already checked for D. So down here, it actually has the type never. And that is a special TypeScript type that means that this object can never get down here if your typings are correct, because we've checked for all the types already. If we end up down here, then something has gone wrong and we can never use this object. This object is just a dumb object that cannot do anything. Now, what if we have an object down here? Well, let's look at it. It's B or E, and that is because we actually return in all these statements except the one where it was B and E. So all these other statements, it exits the function, but this, when it enters these B and E, it actually goes on to complete the function. So if we return here as well, what happens to this down here? Let's see if it knows. It knows unreachable code detected. So it actually knows that we have an if, else, if, else, if, else, and all of them actually return. So we will never, ever get past this if function. So this can never happen. So no matter what code I write down here, I can write console log, test, whatever, it will still complain that you cannot get past this because it doesn't matter. The function will stop before that. Same function, unreachable code detected. So that is the control for analysis. It's super clever, this TypeScript compiler, and it can really help you do stuff correctly with your classes and your interfaces and whatnot. All right, that is generally TypeScript. Let's look at some CRM code. Another thing I didn't show is namespaces. In JavaScript, there are no things as namespaces, but you can sort of cheat them. For example, here I want a namespace called dg.account, and then have a function on this dg.account namespace. And the way you would make it in JavaScript is have the dg variable declared to itself or an empty object, and then declare the next part of your namespace to be itself or an empty object, and then you can start applying your functions. And this right here is just a function that runs on my unload, and it just alerts that I'm unload in my form, for example. So for this project, I have also my TypeScript config file set up, and I'm gonna start converting this to JavaScript. Sorry, TypeScript, of course. So how do you convert it to TypeScript? Well, you just rename it from JS to .ts. It complains that it might be unusable. We don't care. Sometimes we do want you to close this first and then reopen the file before it actually lets you use the TypeScript in it. I'm just gonna close these other files. And voila, we are coding in TypeScript, and it's still fine because valid JavaScript is usually valid TypeScript, unless of course you have type errors, and this is just fine code. So let's start converting this to nicer looking TypeScript. I mentioned namespaces, so we're gonna make a namespace called dg.account. Like so. And I want my unload function within it. I don't have to declare it on this variable. I can just have it in my namespace via function, like so. There we go. I have my function within my namespace space now. Now this function is actually internal to the namespace. This means that this function can only be called from within this namespace now. If I want it to be called from outside, for example, by the form event handler, which I want the form event handler to call my unload function, I need to export this function, which means that I can actually use it from out here, unload, and then call it. If I didn't have this export, this would fail because it doesn't know that the function exists on the account namespace. So we want to export it so my form can call it. Cool. That's just basic TypeScript setup. It has nothing to do with CRM yet, but let's make it about CRM. We need to install this tool that I've talked about, and it can be installed through NuGet packages. I hope I have internet. I'm gonna search for it. It's called XrmDefinitelyTyped. Come on.
Martin, you've gone through a lot of things here, and it sounds like my issues are actually resolved as long as I'm not presenting. So if anybody has any questions in the chat, feel free to enter those in, and I'll bring them up while Martin's talking.
Yeah, sure, bring them.
And the part that I wanted to say earlier was that we don't currently have any speakers for next month. So if there's anything you want to hear about or something that you want to speak on, please let us know. We'll be happy to get you on the schedule.
Seems my NuGet doesn't want to connect. I don't know if NuGet's down or if I've lost my internet connection. Let's hope. It doesn't seem like it wants to find anything. Well, that's just great. Connection attempt failed. I don't know if NuGet's down, but let's use the local version I have, if I have one. I actually don't have a local one. All right, let's see if this NuGet thing is down. Yeah, that looks pretty down to me. Great. All right. I'm just gonna build it locally and then hopefully install it locally, and then it will work. One moment, I'll find my project here. Just gonna build my package if it works.
So I was looking on your delegate site for GitHub for all of the packages, and I didn't see the unit testing framework that you mentioned listed there. Is that in a different spot?
It should be there, but it has different names depending on the versions. So there are a 2011 version and a 2013 version and a 365 version and stuff like that.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's why, but it's not on our webpage yet. It's just on our GitHub page because we're sort of moving all our webpage stuff to GitHub wikis instead, and that just makes it much easier to maintain. All right, I'll build my NuGet package. Let's see if it's there. Hey, it's there. I don't need NuGet anymore. I'm gonna install it from my local package, unless it's gonna complain at me again that it doesn't have NuGet connection. That's just great. All right, I have a backup just in case this might happen. So, start the fiddler. Might be the fiddler, yeah. That is a good point. Kill it. Unable to load, unable to load.
So you have, it's going to your local host for that.
Yeah, that's because I just built my local NuGet package and I'm trying to install it from there. But
it's not loading. It tries to connect to fiddler proxy.
All right, I'm gonna cheat. I have it here over here in another project. So I'm just gonna act like I installed it from NuGet. Promise me it works. I'm just gonna copy this from my tools project to my web resource project. Add it in here. And if I had the NuGet package to be able to install, it would basically just add this folder to your project. I'm just gonna include here. So after I installed the NuGet package, you have these files. Now there's a lot of files, a bunch of them not just the DLLs to run stuff. There's a few helper files to make you run from Visual Studio, the exe file itself, the program itself, and some XML documentation, and the config file, which is one of the most important ones right here. So let's take a look at this one. This is where you enter all your credential stuff and how it should generate the TypeScript files. So I have a lab set up for it here that I'm just gonna quickly log into or type in the credentials for at least. Let's see, I have the code here.
All right, I want everyone to log in and go change his account so he doesn't have access anymore.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
I'm gonna run open a command line from this folder and just run my XrmDefinitelyTyped exe file. Let's hope it can connect to CRM at least, and it's only Nougat that's wrong. Someone's got to spin out a bunch of stuff. Hopefully it's gonna succeed. Let's see. I'm not sure if it's because I'm presenting that it might be jamming up something, but it seems my internet connection is not working very well right now. Yeah, I think it might be my presenting that's not working, or that's blocking something. Someone says that the fiddler that crashed and left the proxy in IE settings. Do I need to restart to fix that, or do you know this? Let's see if I can do this. Open IE. Restart fiddler. Could do that. Of course, there's always technical problems. Yeah, demo effect, typical. It also seems like my computer is running a lot of strain, like actually promoting this. So I don't know if that might have an effect. Come on. Apparently none of my programs are responding right now. Nothing at all. My computer died. Great.
So we're running in about 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
Assuming that nothing's going to magically fix itself in then 10 minutes, did you want to walk through stuff that you've already done, or just kind of give a high level overview of what it does do, or what were you thinking of doing?
Sure. I will just demo this with another project I have. Well, actually, I still have the typings. I actually still have the typings from my testing, so I can still show it off.
All right.
Great. So if this had worked and my executable was able to connect and my computer was not stalling completely, it would generate this typings folder with Exim in between, because that's where I specified the out should be. And it has generated a lot of TypeScript files in here, or TypeScript declaration files rather. So for example, on the forms account, we have main forms, and here we have the two forms that are for account. For example, account DTS, where it describes that these functions are available on the account form. And there's a lot of stuff, of course, but this is not something you have to look at. This is just something you have to use.
I'll also make the point it's something you don't have to deploy as well. So it's only on your local computer, and it doesn't ever get deployed to the server. So you don't have to worry about having to deploy all these extra files. Those .d.ts files are local only.
Yeah, exactly. These are just locally, and it's only a JavaScript file that are still being put up there. So how do you use these forms? Well, we need to first tell this file that we are on this, which form we want to actually make code for. So we can declare the variable of XRM, which is the way you interact with the Xrm API, to be of the type xrm.form.myaccountform.myMainForm, for example, dot my, gotta get the last dot my account form here. Right now I've said that everything in this namespace, the XrM should describe, or be described by, rather, this specific account form. That means when I start using my my typings, I get typings for all of this, of course, but I also get intelligence and autocompletion. So if I press Control Space here, I get all the functions that are available on the page. I can autocomplete to get attribute, which is a function. Then I can actually just go down here and see all the fields that are on my account form, which there are 44 of apparently. And if I just know sort of what the thing is called, I can start typing in the string, for example, account, and then it would show me all the available things. Or if I could try address, I could select the address line 1 or whatever, and then just autocomplete. So if I'm, for example, messing with my account number, I can get like this. Then I can dot on it again and use all the functions that is available on an attribute. For example, get value, which I can complete as function. And if I get this out as my account number and save, then it knows that this account number is actually a string or null, because it can be an empty value. Cool. So we know that our account number is actually a number. Similarly, I can do the set value version of this. I'm trying to set the value, and if I put in a number here, it's going to complain and say this argument is not a string or null or undefined, which is what the set value function needs. So if we put in a string instead, it doesn't complain. Great. Now, what if I had not typed this in correctly? Let's, for example, say I converted some old JavaScript code and there was a bug where someone had written it like this instead. What would the TypeScript compiler say? Let's see. Well, it's going to say this object is possibly undefined. And that means that what you're trying to get here doesn't actually return anything, because from the typings, it knows that this field doesn't exist on this form that you're trying to interact with. So you can catch all your missing fields or your incorrectly named field names in this way and fix them. So that's really neat. And of course, we can use the entire API as it's used. For example, we can say UI.clear form notification get form type, for example. And what is this form type equals? And it's equal to xrm.formType. So we can, for example, compare it if form type equals to xrm.formType. It's an update form, for example. And in my if condition in here, I know it's an update form instead of having this magic number that form type is, where if you look on the right of this pop-up, you can see that it's actually value 2. And this is an enum and a constant enum. So when this is compiled into JavaScript, it actually just writes 2 here and then writes in the comments, as we saw before, that is the update. And then you can use your logic. Cool. That's basic interaction with your form. Let's see, for example, the weird incident reference thing. Primary contact should be one. Yeah, autocompleted. Get value. Frame contact. If we check the type on this, it's actually an XrM incident reference array or null. So that means I cannot actually do anything to this one besides, of course, accessing all the array elements if I've done a null check first. So if it's not null, then I can use all my array stuff on this. For example, get the length of it, as I mentioned before. Or I can, of course, just index in and get the first one, which is then an entity reference with these fields. I hope you can see that this just helps you immensely, like reduce errors and auto-completes a lot of stuff for you and tells you when you make a mistake. And it's just super useful. One last thing I want to show is the endpoint, and I have to be quick here, I see, but XrmDefinitelyTyped, if you put in the right parameters, also generates these XRM query declaration files and some corresponding lib files, which are not shown here because I couldn't generate them. But it's basically a JavaScript file that contains all the logic of XRM query. So how does XRM query work? Well, if you include it on your form before your form script, you can just type XRM query and then start using it. You can set the API if you're using different API versions. This is for the web API, by the way. And you can create and delete and retrieve and whatnot. So let's try to retrieve, for example. XRM query works on Lambda functions mainly. I hope you know what Lambda function is, else you see it now. It's basically where you declare some variable, for example, x in this case, and then the arrow defines the function that says use this variable in this function over here. And on this x, I can actually dot, and I can say, for example, I want to retrieve accounts. Now the query is set up to retrieve accounts, but we want to, of course, filter on it or select some variables. So let's do that. So let's select on it. Again, it also takes a Lambda function. The select function takes returns an array instead of just something. And x in this case is not the other one. It's, of course, all the attributes of account. So let's say I want the primary contact ID out, and I want the account number out. I also want to get the top first one. I don't just want to return one. And I want to filter on it. Let's say I want to filter equals, then I want the account number to be equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is how you make filter functions. Use this global filter that equals or filter dot and or filter dot contains or ends with, or however you want to interact with it. I'm just having a simple equals filter here. So I've constructed my query. I want to actually execute it or do something with it. This is another function I can just call execute. And in this function is also, I'm just going to lambda it. It has a result that I'm going to interact with. Now, what is this result? It might look very ugly, but there's a reason for this. If I hover over it, it's a combination of account fixed and primary contact grid and account number. What does this mean? Well, it's a combination of all those types. So if I get the first one out of it, it has only the things that I've actually selected out from this one up here. It doesn't have all the attributes of the account, but only the stuff that I've selected, which is just super neat if you forgot that you selected something or didn't select something and you're expecting it to be down here. So you can only access the attributes that you actually selected from the account. And of course, these also have the types that you expect them to have. This is a string or null because that's the way the web API works, for example. And you can keep going here with other stuff. A final TypeScript feature that's also supported by XM Query is promises and async await, which means I can basically have this in another function if I want to. Say get primary account, contact grid, of course. Grid, I can't spell. Primary contact grid, and I want to have this in here, but instead of executing it here, I actually just want to promise it. Promise, or I can promise the first one, which is the special thing on retrieve multiple, where you just want to return the first result. And I'm going to return this. Now this function returns a promise. As I see here, it's a promise of the same type as I had before. But what's cool is I can make it asynchronous, which means I up here can say primary contact or result. Then I can await on my get primary contact grid function. Does this not work? Oh yeah, I need to tell my TypeScript that it is allowed to actually use promises, else it's gonna complain to me. So I'm just gonna quickly add this little thing where I allow ES20 promises. So this way, my TypeScript was like, okay, you're allowed to use this. Let's hope this one disappears. Does it do that? Else, we can just change this to a newer version of JavaScript, so it actually allows us to do it. Come on, update.
Martin, you did have a question as well to show an example with an expand, and we are past our time, so I want to be
Sure.
cognizant of everyone else's time. So
Sure. Expand is also just another function where you can dot on it and find all the related entities. For example, primary contact ID. Oh, primary contact ID as it was there, and then it also is included in the result. And my errors finally disappeared. So my result has, no, they came back, never mind. But you can expand like this, and then you can also select variables on your expanded thing here. And that is the last thing I want to show. Yeah, Exim query is quite complicated, and it works quite nicely. It helps you do the right things most of the time. And it doesn't support all the features of Web API, but it supports most of them. All right, quick sum up my presentation. Quick ending, rather. Some advanced addition you can do with this tool. You can have a build server set up that generates these TypeScript interfaces daily, and then daily check if the project still builds. For example, if your client went in and deleted a field on your form that your code relies on, then the next day your build server will tell you, oh, something's wrong, this code is not working anymore. You can also make intersection form interfaces with this tool, which basically means you can, if you have many different similar forms, you can have the tool intersect them, and then you can share code safely across all these forms. Outro. This is all open source on GitHub. If you want to take a look at it, it's in F#, so it's not easy to use if you don't know F#, of course. I have a blog post about it where I go into depth about it as well. I wanted to show off Imposter Fiddler, but apparently it turned out that Imposter Fiddler messed up with me instead. So that goes, but it's a very nice tool that you should look into if you're ever working with verb sources in CRM. And if you want to reach me, I'm at Twitter at this handle. And that is it for me.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. I had a quick question. Can you extend the way of generating those TypeScript definitions? So, for example, we have helper libraries that wrap the XrmDefinitelyTyped calls that do null safe checking for you. So, for example, your getAttribute.getValue. Lots of times we have multiple forms and we run the same JavaScript, and sometimes there's a field there, sometimes there isn't. And for the most part, we really don't care if it's not there. We don't want to generate an actual error.
Sure.
Is there any way to extend that to say, hey, I want to use all this goodness on these methods rather than those methods, if that makes sense?
Sure, there is. But you need to be quite well known with your types and your generics to be able to do this. But it is definitely possible. And you just need to use the types and interfaces that comes with XrmDefinitelyTyped out of the box. You can use them as you like and use them in your helper functions to actually accomplish this.
And then the definitely typed static types that are defined for definitely typed in that GitHub, do you use those as your base definitely typed types, or do you have your own custom ones for those as well? Like, do you extend that, or is it completely different, separate?
I have my own custom one because I've had some other needs, of course, because I'm implementing all the attributes and stuff, which I need to be generics, which I need to be able to substitute into the base XRM file.
Okay.
So I can't use the one on different typed out of the box, but I've made my own, which I use, but it's very similar. And of course, they should be similar because they implement the same basic logic.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Martin. We both had our technical difficulties today.
Yeah, seems like it.
You seem to pull through with flying colors. So thank you very much. I will post this meeting sometime in the near future. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And once again, we don't currently have anything scheduled for next month. So please, if you have something you'd like to present, or something that you would like to present on, we can go and find presenters as well. And hopefully, in the near future, we'll have a new version of Dynamics 365 for us all to start playing around with publicly available. So we'll see whenever that happens. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, and goodbye.